Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kurt Chisholm, and I'll be your host. So today I'm talking with Blake Harris. How you doing today, Blake?
I'm doing great, Kirk. Great to be on the show.
Great, great. Well, glad to have you. We haven't covered this topic in a while, and I think this is going to be really interesting, especially with what's going on in the world. Blake, tell us a little bit about your background.
I am an asset protection attorney. My firm focuses exclusively on setting up offshore trusts to help keep our clients' assets protected from lawsuits and divorce.
Cool. All right. Well, how did you get into that field? You went to law school. Why that part of the field?
Well, I thought it was an area of law where I could make some good money. How's that for an answer? When I started my practice of law over a decade ago, my office was a few blocks away from another attorney's office named Barry Engel. Barry Engel was well regarded as the godfather of asset protection. He's the one who wrote the asset protection trust law back in the 1980s. He was a mentor of mine for many years before he passed away. And while working with and learning from him, I came to realize that there's a great opportunity for Americans to protect themselves from a legal system which has eroded. And we can talk more about how the legal system has eroded in a moment, but it was really an inspiration from the founder of the asset protection industry, or the offshore asset protection industry as it's handled today.
Okay. So let's talk about asset protection. What does that actually mean? Like what's covered under that, just so the listeners know exactly what that means.
So, asset protection is about rearranging your financial affairs so that in the event of a lawsuit, you're better able to hold on to your assets. And my goal is simply to put our clients in a better position than they would be after a lawsuit had they not had the asset protection in place. So, what we want to do is create a structure where our clients can still control, can still invest their money as they wish, but they're not going to be in a position where a court has taken money away from them. They may be able to get to the point where they settle a case. And that's exactly what the planning does. It gives our clients leverage to negotiate a settlement and get a more acceptable settlement for our clients than they may end up getting if there's backs against the wall, or if someone ends up getting a judgment and just starts taking assets from them.
Okay. Interesting. So, now you said lawsuit, but what other things can it protect you against the government? Can it protect you against, like, what can it protect you against outside of lawsuits?
So lawsuits and divorce are the main reasons people create offshore trust. The offshore trust, it also gives you access to foreign investments that you may not have directly as an individual. It allows you to avoid forced heirship or elective share issues as well. It gives you international diversification so that all of your eggs are not held all within the same country that you live, work, and do business in. It is not something that we use to protect against the government, though in the past, if you've set up a trust before there's any issue with the government, it has still prevented the government from getting those assets. But we don't create trust for the purpose of protecting against the government. It's primarily against one of the millions of lawsuits that are filed every single year here in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I know, was it 10 years back or 14 years back when they started instituting some more laws I think they were going after basically foreign assets, the US was, and really targeting UBS and a few others of people who were hiding assets. Um, how does this differ from that? Because if people were just basically hiding money in other countries and they were allowed to bring it back without penalty, but like how is this any different?
So the days of using offshore trusts and offshore bank account for tax evasion are well behind us. There was a time when a lot of undeclared money was being held in Switzerland for Americans. And while this was not in violation of any Swiss laws, this was in violation of US laws. And during the great financial crisis of 2008, the IRS got desperate for money. The Obama administration pressured the IRS. The Obama administration pressured the Swiss banks to release information. And at that time, Swiss banks pretty much decided one of two things. We're either going to drop Americans, which a lot of Swiss banks did. And to this day, many Swiss banks will not work with Americans. And a lot of other Swiss banks said, you know what? Americans have a lot of money, and us bankers, we like money. and they actually changed their business model to accommodate and cater towards Americans. So in terms of using an offshore bank to evade taxes, that's no longer an option. In terms of using an offshore bank in conjunction with an offshore trust to protect assets from a lawsuit, yes, that's still possible.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I know that certainly that has changed in the days of evading taxes through hiding it in foreign banks. Is my dad used to tell me, like, I think this is a big thing in like the 80s or the 90s, or it was the 90s, where they were talking about like, oh, all the criminals have money in Swiss banks, and he was telling me, he's like, yeah, he's like, the government knows where all that money is, even though they won't say anything. Like they know what's there, which wouldn't surprise me, but. So, all right. So it's primarily, so you're not protecting yourself from the government. You're not evading taxes, which is good because that is never a good thing. No one should do that. Disclaimer on the show, not what we're proposing. But it can protect you from creditors. So how does it do that? Like, how does an asset protection trust or how does it protect you against creditors?
So what the trust does essentially is it breaks apart ownership and control. So the owner becomes a Cook Islands trust company. That way, a U.S. court does not have the ability to order the foreign trustee to hand over the assets. U.S. court orders are not recognized in the Cook Islands. If somebody wants to go after your trust, we require them to litigate in the Cook Islands, which is a very hard place to litigate for a number of reasons. You have to prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt. You need to find an attorney who's licensed to practice in the Cook Islands. You have to post a hefty bond requirement. Cases cannot be amended once they have begun. It's just a very hard place to litigate. And most plaintiffs are not going to bother going to the Cook Islands to litigate in a jurisdiction that's expensive and where it's unlikely that they're going to win. Instead, this gives our clients the ability to push back and say, instead of wasting your time and being one of the many people who have failed to break into a Cook Islands trust, take a settlement offer. Now, the beneficial owner will remain the client. So if the client needs a bill paid, if the client wants to buy an asset, if the client wants to take a distribution, they can still do that. So you get all the enjoyment and benefits of having your assets, but you don't have to risk that a court is going to order you to hand them over because they're not yours to hand over anymore.
Okay, so they're not yours, meaning you basically put it into a trust and someone else is the trustee and you're the beneficiary. Is that how it's set up?
Exactly. So you're the grantor, you're the one who creates the trust, you're the beneficiary, you're the one who has the right to receive distributions, but the one who decides when distributions are made, although you can request it, the ultimate decision power is in the hands of a foreign trustee, most likely in the Cook Islands.
But couldn't, well, if they're deciding who takes a distribution, and let's say you say, "Hey, I want a distribution," they say no, then you don't have access to your assets.
Well, the trustee is always going to do whatever it takes to keep the client happy. If they don't do that, then we have the ability to fire and replace a trustee, but that's never been an issue.
Okay. All right. So basically what you're doing is you're frustrating the legal. So this is basically you're frustrating the legal system in a way. I mean, you said it gives you leverage in negotiation. Well, if it's so strong, why bother at all? Why just say, nope, sorry, not negotiating at all?
And sometimes we will advise clients to do that. Certainly, if they're being met with a baloney case, we will tell clients don't make any settlement offer, tell them you have the trust, and tell them to go pound sand. Now, if it's a situation where a client has legitimately harmed somebody, we're going to say, from a practicality standpoint of just doing the right thing, make some settlement offer. Be reasonable in your settlement offer. Don't get taken advantage of because of a mistake you made. But if you legitimately cause somebody harm, I would recommend getting right with them. Now, if the client ends up getting a judgment against them, they're not able to reach a settlement offer, we can prevent we can prevent the creditor from collecting. It does give the creditor still the ability to call the client in for a debtor's exam and have the court re-examine their assets from time to time. And that can be kind of annoying for the client. So if we can get the client a settlement, that means there's no longer judgment hanging over their head. We don't have to worry about them getting called back into court,
Okay.
even though the assets either way would remain protected.
Okay. So, how is this different from domestic? You're talking about a Cook Islands trust, but why couldn't you just set up a trust in like my state of Massachusetts, and wouldn't that be just as sound?
There's more than a dozen different jurisdictions in the United States which allow for the use of a self-settled asset protection trust. The problem, though, is any US based trust is controlled by a US trustee, and a U.S. court can order that trustee to hand over the assets. You get much weaker protection with a domestic trust. There have been several cases where domestic trust completely failed, and plaintiff attorneys know this. And because of that, they will be much more aggressive in going after someone's assets. Does it provide you some protection? Yes, I would say that there's a little bit of a speed bump in between a creditor and their assets when you set up a domestic trust. But with a foreign trust, you have a much stronger shield, a much taller wall for a creditor to go over before they get your assets. And because of this, we've seen situations where once the plaintiff learns that our client has an offshore trust, they simply drop the case. We've also seen situations where the plaintiff is much more willing to settle on much more reasonable terms because of how difficult it would be to get from a foreign trust. So yes, domestic trusts exist, but really, if you're going to do something, if you're going to go through the process of setting up an asset protection plan, establishing an asset protection trust, do it the right way and get yourself the proper protection.
So, yeah, it's interesting because I mean, most people that I know, if they've got a trust, it's a US based trust, right?
Most
It's
people
just
who have a trust probably have what's referred to as a revocable living trust, which is a great trust to have for purposes of passing your assets after you pass away. Avoiding probate is a wise move, and it's helpful for your beneficiaries once you pass away. However, a revocable living trust does nothing in terms of keeping your assets protected from a lawsuit. If you want to keep your assets protected from a lawsuit, you need an asset protection trust. And then within the arena of asset protection trust, it's how good a protection do you want? Do you want something that allows you to push back a little bit, or do you want something that will actually survive the test of a U.S. court and still keep your assets protected?
so it
And then
sounds like really none of the trusts protect you. The difference between this one is just you're frustrating them to the point of it's not worth it to financially pursue the trust is really the issue.
I'm going to disagree on that
Okay.
statement. I think a foreign trust, you can say it does protect you. And there have been many times when plaintiffs did go to the Cook Islands and they were unsuccessful in getting the assets. Whereas there's also been many times where people went out to domestic trust and they were successful in getting the assets. So with a foreign trust, yes, you do get real solid, very good asset protection. There's no guarantees in the legal field. I'm not allowed to make a guarantee, but I will say that we've set up a lot of these trusts. We've had lots of clients go through pretty much any type of legal battle you can imagine. We've never once lost a penny for a client.
So what is so when they're setting these up, I mean, there's got to be a lot more operational logistical challenges in dealing with something like this as opposed to just setting up a domestic trust. So how does that work?
Well, the only difference between a domestic asset protection trust and an offshore asset protection trust is that you do have to report to the IRS and FinCEN that you have an offshore trust and an offshore bank account. We provide our clients a detailed memorandum on how to complete those reporting requirements. It's really not all that complicated with our guidance. And then the client can share that information with their CPA. And simply the client needs to pay a few $1,000s and sign off on some paperwork to complete the IRS reporting requirements. That's really the only difference between a domestic and offshore trust in terms of a compliance or headache that go along with setting it up.
So if you had a offshore trust, you could still invest in domestic assets like the stock market or real estate or anything like that.
Anything you can invest in as an individual, you can invest in through your offshore trust. The difference, though, is the offshore trust gives you access to investments that you may not be able to make as an individual.
Uh, how so?
Certain companies, certain investment funds, certain people don't want to work with an American directly. And if you want to make certain investments, you can do it through your offshore trust.
Okay. All right. Um, all right, that makes sense. So, all right. Well, I guess I would have assumed it would have been a little bit more logistically challenging to deal with an offshore trust. You're telling me it's not. That's good to know.
That's a one of the many misconceptions about the asset protection world, that it's a whole lot more complicated than setting up a domestic trust. Either way, you have a protector. Either way, you have a trustee. Either way, you're transferring assets under the control of a trust company. The benefit is that the foreign trust companies we work with, they are better regulated and supervised than US based trust companies. You also can get access to even better trust companies internationally than you can in the United States. When you bank internationally in a jurisdiction such as Switzerland, your money is actually in a safer jurisdiction than it is here in the US. So really, it just takes somebody who has a mind that's open enough to explore options beyond the US borders for solutions to their issues.
So what's the difference between having a foreign trust in the Cook Islands versus something like Switzerland, or I'm sure there's other countries that have good laws. Like, what's the difference?
Well, Switzerland, for one, doesn't really have any asset protection trust legislation in place. There are more than a dozen, more than probably 2 dozen jurisdictions internationally where you can set up an offshore trust. And I visited many of them. I've been to over 40 countries, met with trust companies, bankers, protectors, investment advisors, CPAs, other attorneys all throughout the world. And through my years of research, we've concluded that the Cook Islands is the best jurisdiction for several reasons. In terms of countries willing to work with Americans, you really have 5 main countries who regularly and gladly work with Americans: Bahamas, Cayman Islands, Nevis, Belize, and the Cook Islands. Bahamas, I think, is popular because of its proximity to the United States, but the Bahamas and Cook Islands are not particularly protective in terms of their legislation. You may want to use Cayman Islands if you're looking to set up a hedge fund, but in terms of asset protection, it's really not an ideal jurisdiction. Neither the Bahamas or the Cayman Islands are ideal for asset protection. In terms of countries with good codified asset protection trust laws, you have Nevis, Belize, and the Cook Islands. Belize has a great law in place. However, it's not really the best place to do business. It's kind of like doing business in Mexico, but it's English speaking. The regulators down there are a little bit inconsistent. The banks are not stable. The government is not the safest government to do business in. Generally, I will avoid using Belize as the jurisdiction for setting up a trust. We do some business down in Belize. I have been there many times, but it's not my first choice for where we're going to set up a trust. Nevis has a great law in place. Their legislation is almost identical to that of the Cook Islands. It's also a safe country to do business in. They have good trust companies. The problem with Nevis is the government has started to grow hostile to the industry. And on several occasions, they have introduced legislation which would greatly water down the protection afforded by their asset protection trust law. Nevis has been making quite a bit of money over the past few years selling golden passports, and they're not as committed to the asset protection industry as the Cook Islands, who has never and probably never will sell a passport. Asset protection is vital to the economy of the Cook Islands. And that's why for 99% of our clients, we use the Cook Islands.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I would have thought Nevis, they would have figured out that if you're getting all that money, you probably want to not grow hostile to the industry, but I get it.
You are very much preaching to the choir. I actually had to send a letter to the Nevisian government a couple of years ago, encourage them not to change their legislation. So far, they haven't, but we're in the process right now of actually migrating all of the Nevis trust we've set up over to the Cook Islands.
Hmm, interesting. All right, well, good to know. So what can be protected with this? Just
So the
cash, or where are the limits?
so the main asset that's being protected is cash in a brokerage account. So the trust would be registered in the Cook Islands, would then open up a Swiss bank account, and then that Swiss bank account can hold various different traditional currencies: the euro, the US dollar, the Swiss franc. It can also hold stocks, bonds, crypto, gold, silver. That is going to be the primary asset that we protect. And that is the asset that gets the best protection because it is held outside the United States. It's easy to move it to another jurisdiction if by chance litigation ever did begin in Switzerland. Other assets that we protect frequently include cryptocurrency. Crypto can be held in a Swiss bank account at a Swiss bank and brokerage firm. It can also be self-custodied by the client under the umbrella of the trust, provided there's no pending litigation, or it can be stored in a third-party vault. Real estate can be held in the trust. If it's your primary home, we may advise putting it directly into the trust if it's not already protected under state homestead protection. And then for any other real estate, that should be held by an LLC or some other corporate entity that is then backed by the trust. With this setup, it gives the flexibility to take further protective measures later and equity strip the property. So either mortgaging it or selling it if that asset ever becomes attacked here in the United States. And then finally, there's a business. Businesses are generally kept outside of the trust, and we would advise clients to take cash out of that business, put the excess cash into the offshore account. Alternatively, the trust can hold the business directly, but as long as it's operating here in the United States, there's still some liability exposure. So the real goal with an asset protection plan is two things: get the control beyond the reach of the United States, and we do that through establishing the trust and having a trustee sit in the Cook Islands, and getting the assets outside the United States. And that's done through equity stripping domestic properties and putting the liquid funds into an offshore bank and brokerage firm.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Um, so now you mentioned for obviously for lawsuits is a big part of it. What about for divorce? That apparently is a big part of this too. How does that work in this?
Divorce, divorce is the most common lawsuit. And while this is not the most romantic advice, getting a prenuptial or postnuptial agreement can save a lot of headache down the road, save a lot of time, money, and energy if you decide who gets what in the event the marriage dissolves while the waters are calm. Problem with prenup and postnuptial agreement is more than a third of them are disregarded by U.S. courts. There's no guarantee that a U.S. court is actually going to hold up and enforce a prenup when push comes to shove. So for better protection and to avoid upsetting your spouse and bringing up the conversation in the first place, what you can do is set up a Cook Islands trust. And in the event of a divorce, the trust can keep those assets protected from a lawsuit.
How does it do that? I mean, in some states like, community property states where, pretty much it's 50-50. How does that protection hold up? I mean, it's pretty much this, it's 50-50. So are you hiding it or are you just, like how does that work?
Well, Kirk, there's no such thing as hiding assets. The court can
Okay.
always want you to disclose your assets. However, disclosure does not compromise protection. If the
Okay.
asset is jointly owned, then we advise clients against putting that into the trust. But if it's individually held, then we would still typically encourage clients to put that into the trust, and they can then use that as leverage to negotiate a settlement with their soon to be former partner.
Yeah, do you find that that works? Because I mean, just from seeing a number of clients go through this over the years, I mean, divorces take sometimes years. It's frustrating, and I imagine if you're in front of a judge and you're basically saying, "Sorry, it's in trust. Haha, you can't touch it." It just seems like that's not going to go very well for the divorce. So I guess I'm just curious in your experience what you've seen and how that impacts it. Lawsuits separate, I get it. You third party, unrelated, but with divorce, it's a little more intimate with the negotiation. So how does that work in your experience?
So, yes, a divorcing spouse is one I would consider a super creditor, one who has more power, one who the judge is more interested in getting a result than necessarily following the law. And there may be situations where courts have been upset by the planning that the client did. However, there's no real punishment that a court can do, provided that the client doesn't lie about their asset, provided the client is fully transparent, and provided the client complies with any court order. For example, the court may say, okay, you set up this trust, you need to request a distribution from your trustee for $2 million. The client will always comply with the court order and say, hey, trustee, send me $2 million. Then the client can say, hello, court, we've done exactly what we were told to do. We have requested the distribution. The trustee, on the other hand, who typically will honor any request, is not going to honor a request that was made under court order, under duress. And the trustee will then withhold and protect the funds. So the client is in compliance with the court order, and the funds remain protected because the foreign trustee is not releasing funds when a request is made under duress.
Okay. So, all right. So basically from that perspective, it's once they know that there's divorce, they kind of go into lockdown mode and they just don't release it.
Correct.
Okay, got it. No, that makes sense.
Now,
That makes
now the client can still get funds out for by their own wishes or to reach a settlement to pay a settlement. But if there's a gun to the client's head, the trustee's not releasing the funds.
Now, how does the trustee know that? Just by saying it and they just go into lockdown mode? Because then at what point does that come off and they're like actually can release it? So, um,
Because when a distribution is requested, the trustee is going to require the client to swear under penalty of perjury that the client is not acting under court order or other form of legal duress.
got it. Okay. That makes sense. Okay.
Court
That's
cannot
interesting.
order the client, and the court cannot and will not order the client to commit perjury.
Okay. Cool. Awesome. Well, this has been very enlightening for me. Any final thoughts or things that we missed, Blake, in our conversation you think the listeners should know about?
Well, just to paint a picture of how serious lawsuits are, there are over 10 million lawsuits filed every single year in the United States. There are billions of dollars ordered to be paid out in judgments every few days. This is a legal system which makes it very easy for a plaintiff to bring a case. They're advertised too frequently by attorneys who are strumming a business which would not otherwise be brought. A case can be brought on a contingency fee, so the plaintiff doesn't need to have any skin in the game. And it can be so defensive to defend a case that we've seen situations where individuals pay out settlements, even though it's a completely baloney case, because it's just simpler and cheaper to pay the settlement than it is the cost to defend a case, which can be very expensive. And what ends up happening is individuals become the victim of what is essentially legal extortion. And we don't want this to happen to our clients. I certainly don't want this to happen to myself either. It's the reason that I have my own Cook Islands Trust. It's the reason that we help clients set up these trusts so that they have peace of mind and know that they can confidently live their life and conduct their business and not have to be concerned that they are going to be taken advantage of by a broken legal system.
Okay. One other thing I forgot to ask. What are the tax implications of this?
So the trust itself is tax neutral. It doesn't increase or decrease your taxes. As I mentioned previously, you do have to report it to the IRS. We provide our clients a detailed memorandum on how to complete those reporting requirements.
Okay. All right. That's good. That's good to know. Okay, cool. Well, Blake, I appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your wisdom with us. Where can people find more about you?
Blake Harris Law. That is the website, blakeharrislaw.com. The social media handles, TikTok, while it's still around, Blake Harris Law. Twitter, or X, formerly known as Twitter, Blake Harris Law. Instagram, Blake Harris Law. LinkedIn, Blake Harris Law. All the major platforms, YouTube, Blake Harris Law, or you can give us a call, 833 Ask Blake.
Awesome. Once again, I appreciate you coming on, Blake. We'll put all that in the show notes for people who want to learn more about what you provide. But yeah, thanks for coming on, sharing your wisdom with us.
Kirk, thanks so much for having me. It was great being here.
Hey, Doug, did you hear? We're giving away free money. Well, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but before I do, there's a saying in the mining community, well, precious metals mining, that is. The saying is that if you want the best deals, you have to be in the room. Now, you're probably thinking, what does it mean to be in the room? Well, I'll tell you. Being in the room means that you're on the short list of people who get invited to be a part of the best deals. These are the deals that most investors will never have access to. You mean like IPOs? Nope, IPOs are chump change. Those are for retail investors, small potatoes. That's nothing compared to these deals. These deals would have you salivating to get access to them. Once you know they exist, you will never look at investing the same way again. I almost don't want to even tell you that they exist because it will ruin your thinking of how the investing world really works. Now, you might be excited that these deals exist, but you only have access to the deals if you're an insider, or in the room as they call it. Now, as loyal listeners to the show, I'm going to give you a chance to be in the room. Money Tree Investing Podcast has created the Insiders Club. This is a community of our show's members who are loyal listeners of the show and want to get more out of their investing experience. Being a part of the Insiders Club gives you insider status for upcoming events and webinars, discounts, free stuff and books, and influence on the future direction of the show. This is a great opportunity to join us as we expand our content and services. Oh, and did I mention free money? Yes, in the next few weeks, I'll be giving away free money to our members of the Insiders Club as my appreciation for listening to the show. Now, there's no cost to join the Insiders Club. Just go to moneytreepodcast.com/free money today to join the community. That's www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. I hope to see you in the room.
All right, well, that was a great interview with Blake. Really appreciate him coming to the show and sharing his wisdom with us. Now we're into the panel portion of the show where we have our very own Barb Freeberg. Hey, Barb.
Hi, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Doing great. We also have a new panelist, Jeff Hewlett. Hey, Jeff.
Hey, Kirk. Good to see you. Good to see everyone.
Yeah, glad to have you on the show. So, Barb, what were some of your takeaways from the interview?
Well, I'm at tax time now and I'm organizing all my taxes and I'm looking at, the trusts and this and that and the complexity. And my first thought, and I probably shouldn't even be saying this online, is it's just another way to add complexity to an already, for some of us, complex financial situation. But all joking aside, if you're in an industry where the possibility of getting sued is high, then this is a legitimate tactic to consider if you're looking to protect your assets.
Yeah, no, that's good. So, Jeff, what about you? What are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I'm on the same page with Barb there. Kind of my thread, and as you guys know, I'm an economist, so I have a sort of specific geeky economist way of thinking about that. But I kind of go to, costs and benefits, but also who would this be good for, right? Asset protection, and I really enjoyed listening to it. It really got my brain turning on this. So I kind of went back to the whole idea of what I call the risk sink industries. What industries are the risk sinks? And when I say risk sink, like literally think of a sink where risk kind of gets trapped. It's where risk goes, right? And when I think about it, I think about professional services industries or pretty much any industry with an end consumer that is protected by significant laws. So think of doctors, think of lawyers, right? And what's interesting is when you think about B2B, business to business, the law is pretty much like, hey, business, you know what you're getting yourself into. You're supposed to be smart enough to handle this. But for consumers, it's different, right? We have a set of consumer protection laws that kind of assume that us people are kind of dumb and that we can't make good decisions and we're easy to take advantage of. So there's much more rigorous laws. So so when I think of asset protection and where it might be, good for, like I think of like taking the medical industry, a doctor, right? Think of today's doctoring. Like when I talk to people today in the doctoring industry, they're like, yeah, I don't spend much time with patients anymore. The insurance companies pretty much price me out. I send in my physician's assistants, I send in my nurse practitioners, the nurses, et cetera. They're the ones that are sort of working with the clients. Doctors now are risk sinks, right? They're the ones with the malpractice insurance or other forms of insurance, and they're the ones that need to protect themselves, right? So I think from that standpoint, I think Barbara suggested it, right? That makes a lot of sense probably in an industry with significant risk sinks.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to look at it. I mean, if I'm thinking about this practically, I work with different clients in different industries, and some of them are really high risk, like doctors, as you said, and then there's some that are really low risk, which is most people, right? You could always get hit with the one-off weird thing, like you get in a car accident and everyone sues each other. But for normal everyday life, doctors get sued all the time, unfortunately. But many other industries don't. And so while I love this topic, because I find it so interesting, and I guess I've been fascinated since I was a kid with the whole Swiss bank accounts thing and the old mafia people trying to hide money. Like I was always fascinated by that as a kid. And of course, when I grew up, we had all the mafia movies, right? You had The Godfather, you had Goodfellas, you had all that stuff, and it was like it was part of culture back then. It was cool, right? Mafia was cool. You had Tony Soprano, you had all that stuff. And so I was always fascinated by it and come to realize that very little, if any of it was true because it's just, as my dad always used to tell me, he's like, there are no secrets. If they want to know something, they're going to know it. As we're finding out with the government right now, there are plenty of secrets that are coming out. So everyone's going to find out. But I think, I liked Blake's perspective because it's not really about secrets. It's about frustrating people, right? It's if people want to come after you hard enough, they're eventually going to get it. It's a question of how much can you frustrate them to go away or to negotiate a reasonable deal, as opposed to coming after you and taking all your hard-earned money. And so I think conceptually, and I know philosophically, some people may disagree. They might say, well, if you did something wrong, you should be able to get it. And there's two sides to that, right? One side is, yes, if somebody did something wrong, they should be able to. But if you look, like, for instance, if you look at Enron, I think it was like Jeff Skilling and who was the other guy? Ken somebody or other? Who was the CEO? Skilling was the CFO. Um, I don't know. My panel's not helping me out here. So anyway, so Jeff Skilling and the other guy, the CEO, they blatantly committed fraud, or if I'm misstating the technical term of what they did, but they did wrong by people, and they got away with it. And one of the way they got away with it was because they owned, like, I think one of them owned like a $40 million house in Colorado, where you had where basically there's certain states where you have the ability to protect the equity in your home. Florida is one of them. And in Massachusetts, I think it's like 500,000 that's totally protected from anybody. So if you get sued, up to 500,000 is protected. If you go to Florida, it's infinite. So to give you an example of how this works, if if I robbed a bank in Massachusetts, and I robbed $50 million from a bank, and I drove down to Florida and I bought a house, a $50 million house, for cash, and then I put a homestead on it, and then I turned myself in, nobody could touch that money. Nobody could touch that house because the homestead laws are so strong. And in Colorado, it's the same way. They also have really strong homestead laws. So I believe what happened, if I'm just going from memory, is a few of those Enron guys basically had really really nice houses, really expensive houses, and they were homestead and they couldn't be touched. So even if they grabbed all the rest of their assets, they still got that as an asset. And while it's nice to know that they can't take your home, it's also weird to think like, oh, you just defrauded a bunch of people and you can't get that money out, and so the rich kind of keep their wealth. And I mean, this is a game that's been going on since the beginning of time, so it's not like, the rich don't have their tricks. And there's more we didn't talk about in the interview, but it's just, there's two sides to it, is my point. Is it's not always just, well, we got to get the rich people. Yeah, but what about the everyday doctors that are in high risk professions that get sued, and not because they did anything wrong, but if you're delivering babies, there are complications. I mean, something goes wrong, they're going to sue the doctor. It doesn't matter if it wasn't the doctor's fault. They're still going to sue him because it's a life, right? And this stuff, and people have emotions. And so you can't look at it from one side versus the other. It has to be two-sided, and I'm not sure what the real answer is, but if you're in a profession that's high risk, you definitely should have you should definitely have avenues to protect yourself. So let's talk about some of that, Barb. What are some ways that everyday people can protect themselves from overeager people looking to sue everybody so they can make a buck?
Well, one thing that the common person can purchase, a type of insurance, is called umbrella insurance. And that is a type of liability insurance that is usually linked to your auto insurance. Now, I don't want any insurance people emailing me or anything because I am not an insurance professional. But my understanding is that the umbrella insurance kind of protects your net worth should you get sued for something. And you need to read the policy. But let's say your net worth is, 500,000, $1 million. You buy $1 million umbrella liability policy. Then should you get sued, you've got that insurance that could kick in if the lawsuit meets the criteria. And it's not terribly expensive. And really, most people that are getting up there in assets probably should have that as kind of another layer of protection.
Yeah, it's great advice. Jeff, what are your thoughts? What are some other ways people can
So,
think of this?
so when I think about risk sinks, and I'm kind of applying it to my life. So I am a real estate investor, a business owner, but as a real estate investor, I've got that B to C thing going, right? Which is I have tenants. And and as a business owner, I have revenues and profits and all that stuff that flow through a business. So the way I think about it is really right along the lines of what Barb was just talking about. So the umbrella piece, the kind of the top end liability piece, is absolutely a part of what I do. But also, I am a big user of the limited liability corporation, or LLC, right? And so so my properties and my businesses are all set up as separate LLCs. And that when you think about protections in our country for the entrepreneur, right, there's really two big protections. One is the LLC and the other one is bankruptcy law. So bankruptcy law says, hey, you can't go less than zero. If it doesn't work out for whatever reason, we have laws to protect people, to encourage them to be entrepreneurs, because if you didn't have bankruptcy, people wouldn't be willing to do it, right? But then on the other side, the LLC for me has been really helpful because I can drop the different properties, and the businesses become basically their own entity, or they're almost like their own person. And so I'm able to diversify my risk through my LLC portfolio. But on top of that, I do have, to Barb's point, those umbrella policies that, and to Barb's point, they're not particularly expensive. They're not insignificant, but but when I think of all the risk, and especially honestly, when I was digging into a little bit of asset protection and what the interview and just a little bit of Google searching I did, it's expensive. To set up an offshore trust has a pretty significant fixed cost. So for me, when I was comparing, hey, for me, I'm a little more normal. LLC / umbrella liability policy versus an offshore trust, the cost benefit for me definitely put me down. I think I'm getting what I need out of that LLC / umbrella approach.
Yeah, it's a good way to think about it. And just for reference, the three people we had: Ken Lay, we had Jeff Skilling, and we had Andrew Fastow were the people who were the main heads. And I believe they were all indicted with fraud. I don't want to mischaracterize people. I don't know what the technical conviction or negotiated thing was. Nowadays, you got to disclaim everything. I don't want to get sued. Um, but yeah, no, I mean it's a good way to think about it with insurance. I mean that's really the nature of insurance, is to protect against hopefully one-off, low probability events, right? And
Mm-hmm.
insurance companies make lots of money because they take money from everybody so that they can pay out the risks when they actually happen. And of course, they defend them and they don't want to negotiate for the full amount, and they do all that stuff. Um, I think in many ways, insurance is really helpful for this. The question is it affordable? Right? If you're a doctor, it's in some cases, depending on the profession, the type of
Right.
doctor, it's really expensive. And it might not, I mean, people think like, oh, doctors make lots of money. Yeah, but they pay huge insurance premiums for their profession. Some of them, right? And some of them, like if you're a brain surgeon, I don't know offhand, but I'm pretty sure that the insurance costs to be pretty high, right? And if you're delivering babies, I'm sure the insurance is pretty high. But if you're just a pediatrician, it's probably pretty low, right? And so, in comparison, right, I want to be clear, it's all expensive. But I think it's when people think, well, doctors make lots of money. Yeah, but the cost of being a doctor are pretty high, and they're getting higher because there are more lawsuits. More people are out for money. They're easy pickings because nowadays, if anything goes wrong, who wants to side with the big companies? They'd rather side with the individuals. So there's many reasons to think about it, but I think insurance is a great first step. One other thing I'll also say about asset protection is I've researched this for the last 20 years. Talked to lots of people who do it in many different ways. Some of them are state, some of them are more federal minded. Um, and the frustration part is really a big part of the process is you have to, if you're going to go down this route, like if you're just getting insurance, that should protect you against most things. Like that is a good blanket statement to say, if you're worried about something, get insurance to protect yourself. Is it E&O insurance? Is it whatever it is for your profession as an umbrella, as you guys are talking about? Insurance is good. Like all these different things will protect you. Um, but then there's the question of if you're taking the extra step to, uh, you can't really hide assets. I mean, technically you can, but you shouldn't. I wouldn't advise it because if you're getting sued, they'll ask you where are your assets, and if you don't say something, then you're lying, which of course is I'm not sure if that's a felony, but it's a serious crime. So you can't really lie. The question is, well, you know, how do you protect yourself? Do you put it in other people's names? Well, that's one option, right? You can put it in somebody else's name. You could frustrate people, which has always been an option. I've talked to some real estate investors. Barb, you're a real estate investor, you probably have some insight. You're not just owning the rental property in your name unless you want to get sued for everything you own. Put it in LLC or put it in a trust or all the things, depending on the state, people do different things. And people will set it up so that it's self-contained, so you can't go beyond the property, or people don't know who's the owner, which is another thing. If you have renters, maybe you don't want the renters to know who owns the place. So they don't show up at your house at 5 in the morning saying, "Hey, come fix my toilet." You know, like all the things that happen. And it's so there's reasons for it. It's not always cut and dry, but I think the important takeaway is that if you go down the frustration route, if you take the extra step to like frustrate the potential lawsuit, it's an enormous amount of time and organization to keep track of this. You know, it's not just I just put it on a shelf somewhere and hopefully it never applies. No, if you're putting money there, if you're putting money in an offshore account, you got to move money back and forth. You got to worry about this, you got to worry about that. You got to make sure that you're signing it properly, that every single thing lines up, right? Because if you're getting a lawsuit and you sign a trust, not as trustee, but as you personally, they could say, "Oh, you didn't sign as trustee, you signed it personally." And it's a little thing, right? It's a small little thing, but if you do that one thing, they say, "Oh, doesn't qualify because you signed it personally, so we can go after you." Sometimes it's little things like that are just allowed to pass. So the more complexity you add, the more possibility for errors, the more possibility for holes that they can get you through because you didn't do something exactly right. So you have to be the kind of person who's meticulous enough to do everything in a certain way, or, you know, mistakes can cost you. So I just kind of point that out because I'm fascinated with this. I've talked to lots of people who go down this road, and I'm fascinated with it. So maybe it's my dad being an attorney helps me be fascinated with it. But it is something that I've always found interesting. So um, as we kind of wrap it up here, Barb, final thoughts from you.
Well, if you have assets, there's always a risk that someone's going to come and try and get them. And there's other things that can happen in your life that can hurt those assets. So it remains a question for you. Are you going to get insurance to protect your assets? Are you going to set up an LLC, which I think Jeff mentioned, and obviously is just, having your own business 101. Most of us either have an LLC or another type of protected status for our businesses. And then we didn't discuss this, but I think this is important. Are you going to conduct yourself ethically? Because if you conduct yourself ethically, theoretically, you will reduce your possibility of being sued. So there's a lot of steps you can take to protect your assets, and all of them cost money. So you have to weigh the cost versus the probability of getting sued, and what are the least expensive ways that you can get the most amount of protection for yourself. So, in essence, it doesn't hurt you to talk with an attorney. Just get an idea of what options are out there given your particular situation. I'm Barbara Friedberg. You can find me on YouTube and at Barbara Friedberg Personal Finance. See you next time.
Thanks for coming on, Barb. Jeff, final thoughts from you.
You know, I think you hit on something really good, Kirk, and it really sort of dovetails with what Barbara was just talking about, insurance. And I spend a lot of time with this actually, both in my writing research and when I spend time with my college students, is just around the difference between risk and ruin. I think people misunderstand sometimes what insurance, the proper use of insurance is for. You face lots of risks in your life. We all do. Things can happen. The question really becomes, what do you self-insure? Like just stuff you pay for. You drop your iPhone, and do you insure that, or do you just buy a new iPhone? But to me, the best use for insurance is not for risk; it is to protect against ruin, right? And so all the things we're talking about here today, to me, really focus on that whole notion of the proper use of insurance, which is you have big downside. If somebody came after your net worth, or if somebody got really, really hurt on one of your properties, or as a result of something you were doing, whether you meant to or not, of course, I would think you wouldn't mean to, or I wouldn't mean to, but it could happen. Those are potential ruin events. So my whole thing is always think about the insurances, focus on a ruin event as why you would pay for insurance. And then certainly if asset protection makes sense for you, an offshore account, the way, it was talked about earlier, absolutely. But consider in the context of what you're really trying to protect against and whether it's right for you and what you do for a living.
All right. So where can people find more about you, Jeff?
Yeah, so Personal Finance Reimagined at financerevamp.com. Check me out. We're all about helping people. It's a decision-making and financial education platform.
Nice. Well, thanks for coming on the show. That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, Wealth Manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.